The small town of Shadow Creek, Arkansas, had always seemed to exist between two worlds, the mundane reality of 1830s frontier America and something darker that whispered from the swamps and thick forests surrounding it. John Blackwood knew this liminal quality better than most as he stood on the porch of his family's aging manor house, watching storm clouds gather over the distant hills. At 45, John's once jet-black hair was now streaked with silver, his tall frame still imposing, but beginning to bear the subtle stoop of a man carrying invisible weights. The Blackwood estate, once the grandest property in the county, had fallen into a state of elegant decay that mirrored the family's declining fortunes. Yet the townsfolk still regarded the Blackwoods with a mixture of respect and unease, stepping aside when John walked down the main street, tipping their hats while averting their eyes. That morning had begun like any other, until Sheriff Miller arrived with news that made John's blood run cold. Another farm abandoned overnight, the sheriff had said, nervously twisting his hat in his hands as he stood in John's study. The Wilkins place, all their belongings left behind, just like the others. That makes 3 families in 2 months. The sheriff had hesitated then, clearing his throat before adding what they both knew hung in the air unspoken. Folk are talking, John. They're saying it's happening again, like in your grandfather's time. John had dismissed the man with reassurances he himself didn't believe, promises to look into the matter that rang hollow even as he spoke them. Now, alone on the porch, he allowed the mask of confidence to slip, revealing the troubled expression he hid from the world. Inside the manor, a fire crackled in the great stone hearth, pushing back against the unusual chill that had descended over Shadow Creek, despite it being only early autumn. John's sister Margaret moved silently through the dimly lit corridors, her perpetual mourning attire making her seem like one of the shadows that clung to the corners of the house. "You know what they're saying in town," she said, not a question but a statement as she appeared in the doorway behind him. 10 years his junior, Margaret had never married, devoting herself instead to preserving the Blackwood legacy and its secrets. They blame us for the disappearances, just as they blamed father for the drought of 98 and grandfather for the fever that took half the county in 67. "Let them talk," John replied, his voice carrying a weariness that belied his dismissive words. Words can't harm what history has already set in motion. But even as he spoke, he knew that the whispers weren't merely superstition this time. The signs were unmistakable, the unseasonable storms, livestock found wandering with strange markings carved into their hides, the eerie lights seen dancing over the marshes to the east of town. Something was awakening in Shadow Creek, something tied to the Blackwood name in ways few alive still remembered. John had spent decades trying to bury the truth of his family's rise to prominence, trying to be the respectable businessman and community leader his position demanded. But the past was clawing its way back to the surface, and he could feel its pull like an undertow, threatening to drag him into depths he had sworn never to explore. The Blackwood family hadn't always been wealthy landowners. Their ascent had begun 3 generations earlier, when Josiah Blackwood, a penniless immigrant with peculiar ideas and strange books, had arrived in the territory. Local legend held that Josiah had made a fortune overnight, though accounts varied on how this miracle occurred. Some said he had discovered a lost Spanish treasure in the caves that riddled the hillsides. Others whispered of midnight pacts sealed with entities not of this world, bargains paid for with something more valuable than gold. Whatever the truth, within a year, Josiah had built the manor house and acquired vast tracts of land, establishing a dynasty that would dominate Shadow Creek for decades to come. As twilight deepened into night, John retreated to his study, pulling from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards the leather-bound journal he had sworn never to open again. Its pages contained his grandfather's meticulous records, not of business transactions or crop yields, but of rituals performed under moonless skies, sacrifices offered to names written in languages no university taught. John had discovered the journal as a young man and had nearly destroyed it in horror before his father had stopped him. "This is our heritage," his father had told him, his eyes reflecting a fervor that had frightened John more than the book itself. "This is the source of our power. the reason the Blackwood name still means something. One day, you'll understand the necessity of keeping such knowledge alive. John had rejected that necessity, focusing instead on legitimate enterprises, expanding their timber operations, investing in the nascent railroad industry, building a reputation as a philanthropist who funded the town's first school and hospital. For years, it seemed his strategy had worked. The strange occurrences that had plagued Shadow Creek during his grandfather's and father's tenures had ceased. The Blackwood name had begun to lose its sinister connotations, becoming associated instead with progress and civic duty. But now, as John lit a lamp and opened the journal's cracked leather cover, he knew that the respite had been temporary. The bill for his family's ancient transgressions was coming due, and he would be the one forced to pay it. The journal's pages revealed a history far darker than even the town gossips imagined. Josiah Blackwood had indeed found something in the Arkansas wilderness, not Spanish gold, but evidence of older civilizations that had practiced arts forgotten by the modern world. He had learned their secrets, adapted their rituals, and used that forbidden knowledge to bend reality to his will. Crops flourished on Blackwood land even during the harshest droughts. Rivals fell ill or suffered mysterious accidents. And when 3 families who had opposed Josiah's land acquisitions vanished without trace in the winter of 1765, no one had dared raise questions too loudly. The pattern had repeated itself through the generations. Periods of prosperity punctuated by inexplicable tragedies befalling those who challenged Blackwood interests. A knock at the study door startled John from his reading. It was Abraham, the elderly caretaker who had served the family since before John was born. "Pardon the interruption, Mr. Blackwood," the old man said, his rheumy eyes avoiding the open journal on the desk. "But there's a matter requiring your attention at the North Field. The workers have found something while clearing the new section for planting." There was a hesitancy in Abraham's voice that immediately set John on edge. The North Field bordered the oldest section of Blackwood property, land that had been left untouched since Josiah's time due to its poor soil quality. John had only recently decided to expand their agricultural operations to that area, hoping modern farming techniques could succeed where traditional methods had failed. "What kind of something, Abraham?" John asked, closing the journal and returning it to its hiding place. The caretaker shifted uncomfortably, his gnarled hands worrying the brim of his cap. "Best you see for yourself, sir. The men won't go back to work until you do. They're saying—" He trailed off, then gathered himself. "They're saying they've found the old altar stone, sir. The one from the stories." The blood drained from John's face. The altar stone was supposed to be a myth, a fabrication created by jealous neighbors to tarnish the Blackwood name. His father had assured him of this, even as he had forbidden John from ever developing the North Field. Now, as John grabbed his coat and followed Abraham into the gathering darkness, he wondered what other myths about his family might prove uncomfortably real. The workers had built a bonfire near their discovery, its flames casting long shadows across the freshly tilled earth. They stood at a distance from the object they had unearthed, clustered together like children, frightened of the dark. As John approached, they parted silently, allowing him to see what had caused their distress. There, protruding from the rich Arkansas soil, was a slab of black stone, unlike any natural formation in the region. Its surface was unnaturally smooth, marked with symbols that matched those in Josiah's journal, spirals and angles that seemed to shift subtly when viewed from different perspectives. But most disturbing were the deep channels carved into the stone's surface, all converging toward a central basin that still bore the rust-colored stains of what John refused to acknowledge might be blood. "We'll leave this be," John announced, his voice steadier than he felt. "Fill in the excavation and move the planting to the east section instead." The workers visibly relaxed, though their eyes still darted nervously toward the stone. "Double wages for today's work and your discretion," John added, knowing that stories would spread regardless, but hoping to blunt their impact. As the men began shoveling soil back over their discovery, John noticed something glinting in the freshly turned earth near the altar. Bending down, he retrieved a small object and quickly pocketed it before anyone could see, though a cold weight settled in his stomach as his fingers recognized the shape. A silver pendant in the form of an 8-pointed star, identical to the family crest that hung above the manor's entrance. As John made his way back to the house, the pendant seemed to burn against his chest, where he had tucked it into his inner pocket. The discovery of the altar stone was bad enough, tangible evidence of the rituals described in Josiah's journal, but the pendant was far more troubling. According to family records, such stars had been given to Blackwood allies as symbols of protection and favor. Finding one at the altar site suggested that the disappearances of the past hadn't been simple eliminations of business rivals. They had been something far more ceremonial, with willing participants among the townsfolk. By the time John reached the manor, a decision had crystallized in his mind. The time for ignoring his heritage had passed. If Shadow Creek was indeed experiencing a resurgence of the phenomena that had marked his ancestors' times, he needed to understand exactly what forces were at work and whether they could be stopped before more people vanished into the night. The Shadow Creek Historical Society occupied a modest building on the town's main street, its collections consisting mainly of agricultural implements, faded photographs, and the personal effects of the area's earliest European settlers. John had helped fund the society's establishment years earlier, partly out of genuine interest in preserving local history, but also as a way to control which versions of that history were prominently displayed. Now, as he entered the hushed interior with its smell of dust and aged paper, he wondered if he had been too successful in burying certain truths. The elderly curator, Professor Willis Hampton, looked up in surprise at John's arrival. "Mr. Blackwood, this is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to our humble repository?" "Research, Professor," John replied, removing his hat and gloves. "I'm interested in the town's early days, particularly any records you might have regarding the first families to settle here." Hampton's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor as he led John to a small reading room in the back of the building. "Most of what we have on the pioneering period is fragmentary at best," he explained, pulling several leather-bound volumes from a locked cabinet. "The courthouse fire of 1802 destroyed many official records, and much of what we know comes from personal journals and correspondence." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I should mention that some of these accounts mention your ancestor, Josiah Blackwood, in contexts that might be considered uncomplimentary." John nodded, unsurprised. "I'm aware of the rumors, Professor. Every successful family attracts its share of gossip and envy. I'm interested in facts, not frontier tall tales." Hampton seemed relieved by this response and left John alone with the materials, mentioning that he would be at the front desk should John require assistance. Once alone, John began methodically working through the documents, searching for any mention of the 8-pointed star pendant or references to the north field where the altar stone had been discovered. Most of the accounts confirmed what he already knew. Josiah Blackwood had arrived in 1763, acquired land through means that raised eyebrows but broke no laws, and quickly established himself as the area's preeminent citizen. It was in the journal of Reverend Thaddeus Clark, Shadow Creek's first minister, that John found something new. The Reverend's increasingly agitated entries from the winter of 1765 described growing unease about ungodly practices taking place on the Blackwood property. He wrote of parishioners who began avoiding church services, of night gatherings in the forests, and of strange symbols appearing on doorways throughout the town. Most alarmingly, he mentioned a secret society forming around Josiah Blackwood, men and women who wore silver stars and called themselves the Illuminated. The Reverend's final entry, dated February 3, 1766, stated his intention to confront Josiah directly about these matters. There were no further entries, and according to a note added by a later hand, Reverend Clark had left town suddenly, his destination unknown. John's research was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Miller, whose surprised expression suggested he hadn't expected to find the town's wealthiest citizen buried in historical documents on a weekday afternoon. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "Professor Hampton mentioned you were here." I was just dropping off some old arrest records for the archives. John nodded politely, wondering if this was truly a coincidental meeting or if Miller had sought him out. The sheriff lingered, clearly wanting to say more, and finally pulled up a chair across from John. "Forgive my directness, sir, but there's been another disappearance. The Thornton boy, 19 years old, worked at the mill. His mother says he mentioned visiting Blackwood Land the night before he vanished. Something about meeting friends near the old creek bend." The creek bend was less than a mile from the north field where the altar stone had been uncovered. John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "I've given no permission for gatherings on my property, Sheriff." Perhaps the boy was confused, or his mother misremembered. Even as he spoke, John recalled passages from his grandfather's journal, describing how the chosen would feel drawn to certain places without knowing why, guided by forces they couldn't comprehend. Could the Thornton boy have been responding to such a call? And if so, who or what was doing the calling now that 3 generations of Blackwoods had abandoned the old practices? Sheriff Miller seemed unconvinced by John's suggestion, but lacked grounds to press further. "Well, if you hear anything that might help locate the boy, I'd appreciate you letting me know." His mother's beside herself with worry. After the sheriff's departure, John continued his research with renewed urgency, moving from the Historical Society to the town's small library, and finally to the private collection of Judge Emerson, whose family had been in Shadow Creek almost as long as the Blackwoods. By dusk, he had pieced together a disturbing narrative that both confirmed and expanded upon the contents of Josiah's journal. His ancestor had indeed formed a circle of followers who participated in rituals at the altar stone, ostensibly to ensure prosperity for the community. These ceremonies had coincided with bountiful harvests and an unusual absence of the diseases that typically plagued frontier settlements. But they had also coincided with disappearances, not random victims, but specifically selected individuals who had been in some way marked beforehand. The 8-pointed star emerged as a central symbol in these accounts. It appeared in various contexts, as pendants worn by Josiah's inner circle, as markings left on doors of houses where someone would soon vanish, as designs carved into trees surrounding the ritual sites. One particularly detailed account, written by a woman who claimed to have briefly joined the group before fleeing in horror, described how the stars were said to open the way and mark those chosen to cross the threshold. Most disturbing was her insistence that those who disappeared had gone willingly, even eagerly, believing they were ascending to some higher plane of existence rather than meeting their end. Whether this was true or merely a justification created by those responsible, John couldn't determine from the fragmented records. As night fell over Shadow Creek, John made his way back to the manor, his mind racing with implications. The parallels between the current disappearances and those of his grandfather's time were too strong to be coincidental. Someone was reviving the old practices, using knowledge that should have been accessible only to those with Josiah's journal. But who? John had kept the journal hidden for decades, and his sister Margaret, while devoted to family traditions, had always seemed repulsed by the darker aspects of their heritage. Could there be another copy of the journal, or perhaps a separate record of the rituals that had fallen into other hands? Or was something else at work, something that operated according to cycles and seasons beyond human understanding, awakening now just as it had in Josiah's time? John found Margaret waiting for him in the manor's library, a single lamp illuminating her severe features. "You've been asking questions in town," she said without preamble, stirring up matters best left undisturbed. There was an edge to her voice that John had rarely heard before, a tension that went beyond her usual reserve. "People are disappearing, Margaret," he replied, removing his coat and pouring himself a generous measure of brandy, "just as they did in grandfather's time. And now I've found evidence that these aren't random tragedies. They're connected to our family, to practices Josiah brought to Shadow Creek. We can't simply ignore what's happening." Margaret's laugh was bitter, almost mocking. "Ignore? Is that what you think I've been doing all these years while you played the respectable businessman? Someone had to maintain the old knowledge, John. Someone had to remember what our family truly is." what obligations we bear." She rose from her chair, moving to a bookshelf and removing a volume that John had always assumed was merely decorative. As she opened it, he saw pages covered in the same handwriting as Josiah's journal, but the entries were dated much more recently, some from just weeks earlier. "You weren't the only one Father entrusted with family secrets," Margaret said, her voice now eerily calm. "He recognized that you lacked the commitment our heritage demands, so he ensured there would be another keeper of the flame." John stared at his sister, this woman he had lived alongside for 4 decades without truly knowing her. "Are you responsible for what's happening? The disappearances, the signs?" Margaret shook her head, her expression a mixture of condescension and something like pity. "I maintain the records, preserve the knowledge, but I haven't performed the rituals. I haven't needed to. The cycle is returning on its own, just as the journals predicted it would. Every 65 years, the stars align in particular ways. The barriers between worlds grow thin, and what was bound seeks to break free." Josiah understood this. Father understood this. Only you have refused to see what's right in front of you. "And the people who have vanished? What about them?" John demanded, his voice rising despite his effort to remain calm. Margaret's face hardened. "Necessary adjustments. The balance must be maintained, John. Our ancestor made promises, entered into bindings that cannot simply be wished away because they make you uncomfortable. The prosperity of this land, our prosperity, has always come at a price." She closed the book and returned it to its hiding place. "The real question isn't who's responsible for the disappearances. It's who will control what comes next. Because something is coming, brother. Something that has waited patiently through the decades of your neglect. And it will not be denied its due." Margaret left John alone in the library, the implications of her words settling over him like a shroud. All these years, he had believed he was protecting Shadow Creek by turning away from Josiah's practices, by focusing on legitimate business and philanthropy. But according to Margaret, his actions, or inactions, had simply allowed forces beyond his control to operate unchecked. If she was right, if some cycle established by Josiah was indeed reaching its culmination, then Shadow Creek faced a reckoning that went far beyond a few mysterious disappearances. But what exactly was coming, and could it still be prevented, or at least directed, by someone who understood the mechanisms at work? With these questions burning in his mind, John made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life and the fate of Shadow Creek. He would perform one of the rituals described in Josiah's journal, not the blood ceremonies that had taken place at the altar stone, but a more benign invocation designed to reveal hidden knowledge. The ritual required specific preparations and could only be performed at midnight during certain lunar phases. Consulting an almanac, John determined that the coming night would be suitable. He spent the remaining hours gathering the necessary components, certain herbs that grew on Blackwood land, water from the creek that gave the town its name, and most importantly, a personal item from someone who had crossed the threshold Josiah's followers had spoken of. For this last element, John returned to the north field where the altar stone had been discovered. The workers had indeed filled in the excavation as directed, but the outline of the stone was still visible as a depression in the earth. Kneeling beside it, John began carefully digging, not to uncover the stone itself, but to search the surrounding soil for additional artifacts. His patience was rewarded when his fingers touched something small and metallic, a button tarnished with age, but still recognizable as having come from a man's waistcoat of colonial design. This, he decided, would serve as his connection to those who had participated in the original rituals, a tether to whatever knowledge they had gained in their crossing. As midnight approached, John secluded himself in his study, arranging the components of the ritual according to the journal's instructions. He drew the required symbols on the floor with chalk, placed candles at specific points around the circle, and positioned himself at its center with the button clutched in his left hand. The journal warned that what followed would be disorienting, perhaps even frightening, but insisted that no permanent harm would come to the practitioner if the procedure was followed exactly. Taking a deep breath, John began reciting the incantation, words in a language he didn't recognize, but whose syllables seemed to resonate in his bones as he spoke them. As he completed the final phrase, the candles flickered violently, though there was no draught in the closed room. The air grew heavy, charged with a presence that pressed against John's skin like an incoming storm. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, he was no longer alone in the study. The figure that stood before him wasn't physically present. John could see the bookshelf through its translucent form, yet it possessed a weight and reality that transcended ordinary perception. It wore the clothing of Josiah's era, its features bearing the unmistakable Blackwood characteristics that had been passed down through generations. "You seek knowledge," the apparition said, its voice sounding simultaneously from all directions. "But are you prepared for the burden it carries?" John struggled to maintain his composure, reminding himself that this was exactly what the ritual had been designed to achieve: contact with those who had gone before, who had crossed whatever boundary separated ordinary reality from what lay beyond. "I seek to understand what's happening to Shadow Creek," he replied, surprised at the steadiness of his own voice, "and to learn what role my family plays in it." The apparition seemed to consider John's words, its form shifting slightly, like smoke in a gentle breeze. "Your family," it finally responded, the phrase carrying a weight of irony. "The Blackwoods have always been merely vessels, John, channels for forces that existed long before your ancestor stumbled upon this land and recognized its potential." The figure moved around the circle, examining the ritual components John had arranged. Josiah was a man of vision, I'll grant him that. He understood that certain places serve as natural confluences of power, points where the barriers between worlds grow thin. Shadow Creek sits atop such a confluence. The native tribes knew this. They avoided this valley, using it only for specific ceremonial purposes. But Josiah saw opportunity where they saw danger. John absorbed this information, connecting it with fragments he had gathered from his research. The historical records had indeed mentioned that the area had been curiously devoid of permanent native settlements, despite its fertile soil and abundant water. "What exactly did Josiah do?" he asked, aware that the ritual would maintain the apparition's presence for only a limited time. "What forces did he channel, and to what end?" The figure's expression changed, becoming something close to amusement. "He made a bargain, of course. Isn't that what men of ambition have always done? He offered regular tribute, energy, life force, consciousness, in exchange for prosperity and influence. A simple transaction, though executed with unusual sophistication. The disappearances," John said, the pieces falling into place. "They weren't murders or abductions in the ordinary sense. They were sacrifices." The apparition nodded, seeming pleased with John's understanding. "Precisely, but not unwilling ones, at least not entirely. The eight-pointed star serves as both beacon and gateway. Those who wear it or are marked by it become attuned to the voices from beyond. They begin to hear the call, to feel the pull toward transcendence. By the time they reach the altar, most go willingly into the embrace of what waits on the other side." The casual way the entity described this process chilled John to his core. He thought of the Thornton boy and the others who had recently vanished, wondering if they too had heard these voices, felt this pull. "And now the cycle is returning," John said, repeating Margaret's words. "After 65 years of relative dormancy. Why? What happens during these periods?" The apparition's form became more distinct, as if John's questions had somehow strengthened its manifestation. The stars align, the barriers thin, and the gateway opens wider than at any other time. During ordinary years, only individual consciousness can pass through, a steady trickle of tribute. But during the alignment, larger exchanges become possible. Josiah understood this. He arranged for the first alignment to bring prosperity to Blackwood lands that would last generations. Your grandfather used the second to expand the family's influence beyond Shadow Creek. And now, the third approaches. John felt a growing sense of dread as he contemplated the implications. And what is supposed to happen during this alignment? What did Josiah plan? The apparition's expression became unreadable, its features momentarily blurring into something that seemed less human. That depends on who controls the gateway when the moment arrives. Your sister believes she knows Josiah's intentions, but her understanding is incomplete. There are other interested parties who have been preparing for this moment far longer than Margaret has been alive. Ubitim. Before John could press for clarification, the apparition continued, its voice taking on new urgency. The alignment reaches its peak in 3 days' time, at the dark of the moon. The gateway will open fully then, allowing passage in both directions. What enters and what exits will be determined by whoever stands at the altar stone and speaks the words of unmaking. Words of unmaking? John repeated, the phrase sending a shiver down his spine despite its abstract nature. The apparition nodded, its form beginning to fade as the ritual's power waned. The final incantation, the key that unlocks the gateway completely. Josiah recorded it in a separate text, not the journal you possess, but another, hidden where only a true Blackwood could find it. The figure was becoming increasingly transparent, its voice more distant. Your sister seeks this text now, as do others in Shadow Creek who wear the star. Find it first, John Blackwood, if you wish to have any say in what becomes of your family's legacy and the town your ancestor damned with his ambition. With those ominous words, the apparition vanished completely, leaving John alone in his study, the candles extinguished, and the ritual components scattered as if struck by a sudden wind. For several minutes, he remained seated in the circle, processing what he had learned. If the entity spoke truth, and something in John's blood told him it did, then Shadow Creek stood on the precipice of a calamity far greater than a few mysterious disappearances. In 3 days' time, whatever bargain Josiah had struck generations ago would reach its culmination, potentially unleashing forces beyond human comprehension upon the unsuspecting town. And somewhere, hidden on Blackwood property, was a text containing the key to controlling this outcome. The first light of dawn was breaking when John finally emerged from his study, his mind racing with possibilities. Where would Josiah have hidden something so important? Not in the manor itself, which had been rebuilt twice since his time due to fires and structural issues. Not in any obvious location that might be discovered accidentally by servants or visitors. It would be somewhere significant to the rituals, somewhere connected to the power Josiah had tapped into. The altar stone was the most obvious candidate, but John doubted his ancestor would have left something so crucial exposed to the elements, especially given the clear indications that the altar had been deliberately buried at some point after Josiah's death. As John pondered these questions over a hastily prepared breakfast, Abraham appeared in the doorway, his aged face creased with concern. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Blackwood, but there's something you should know. Miss Margaret left the house before sunrise, taking the old mare and a travel bag. And she wasn't alone. I saw Judge Emerson's son waiting for her at the edge of the property." This news startled John. William Emerson was a contemporary of his, a quiet, scholarly man who had always seemed more interested in books than in the social connections his father's position might have afforded him. That he might be involved with Margaret and whatever she was planning added a new layer of complexity to an already bewildering situation. "Did you overhear anything of their conversation or destination?" John asked, already rising from the table. Abraham shook his head. "No, sir. They spoke briefly, then rode off together toward the East Woods. The East Woods bordered the creek that gave the town its name, stretching for miles into territory that remained largely undeveloped even after nearly 70 years of European settlement. If Margaret and William were searching for Josiah's hidden text, that would be a logical place to start. Remote, connected to the natural features that had drawn Josiah to the area in the first place, and large enough to conceal almost anything from casual discovery. John quickly gathered supplies for what might be an extended search: food, water, a lantern, and most importantly, Josiah's journal, which might contain clues to the location of the missing text. He also retrieved a pistol from his desk drawer, loading it with care. He wasn't sure what dangers might await in the Eastwoods, but the conversation with the apparition had left him unwilling to face them unarmed. As he prepared to leave, a knock at the front door drew his attention. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his expression grim. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to speak with you about William Emerson. He's been reported missing by his father, and one of my deputies saw him near your property early this morning." Thinking quickly, John decided that a partial truth would serve better than an outright lie. "William came to see my sister, Sheriff. I believe they had some research matter to discuss, historical documents related to the county's founding families. Margaret mentioned they might ride out to examine some sites of historical interest." This wasn't far from what John suspected was actually happening, though he omitted any mention of hidden texts or supernatural gateways. Sheriff Miller seemed partially satisfied, but still concerned. "Judge Emerson says his son has been acting strangely these past weeks, secretive, staying out at odd hours. And there's something else. The judge found this in William's study." He produced a small cloth bag and opened it to reveal a silver pendant in the shape of an 8-pointed star, identical to the one John had found near the altar stone. The sight of the pendant confirmed John's growing suspicions. William Emerson wasn't just assisting Margaret. He was one of the interested parties the apparition had mentioned, someone who wore the star and had been preparing for the coming alignment. But was he working with Margaret toward a common goal, or using her to advance some separate agenda? And how many others in Shadow Creek might be involved, forming a modern equivalent to the secret society Josiah had established? "I'll keep an eye out for them during my own errands today, Sheriff," John promised. "If I see William, I'll be sure to mention his father is looking for him." Sheriff Miller nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response, though his eyes lingered curiously on the packed saddlebag John had prepared. Once the sheriff had departed, John wasted no time in setting out for the East Woods. He rode hard, hoping to make up for Margaret's head start, following the most direct path to the creek that he knew. As he traveled, he reviewed what he had learned about Josiah's practices and the locations that had been significant to his rituals. The altar stone was clearly central, but the historical accounts had also mentioned other sites. A cave system in the eastern hills, a peculiar formation of standing stones that predated European settlement, and most frequently, a bend in the creek where the water flowed over a bed of unusual black pebbles. This last location appeared repeatedly in the witness accounts, described as a place where Josiah's followers would gather before proceeding to the altar for the main ceremonies. The creek bend proved easy enough to find, its distinctive black pebbles gleaming dully in the midday sun. John dismounted, securing his horse to a nearby tree, and began examining the area carefully. The banks were steep here, with exposed tree roots creating natural steps down to the water's edge. Near the bottom, partially hidden by overhanging vegetation, John noticed what appeared to be a small opening in the bank. Not quite a cave, but a hollow where the soil had been worn away around a large, protruding stone. Drawing closer, he saw that the stone bore faint markings similar to those on the altar, though simpler in design. This had to be significant, perhaps a marker Josiah had left to guide those who knew what to look for. Pushing aside the vegetation, John discovered that the hollow extended further than was initially apparent, forming a narrow passage into the bank. He lit his lantern and proceeded cautiously, the space barely wide enough for his shoulders. After about 15 feet, the passage opened into a small, roughly circular chamber that appeared to have been at least partially shaped by human hands. The walls were lined with niches containing decayed remnants of candles, and the floor had been leveled and packed hard. But most striking was the stone pedestal in the center of the chamber, topped with a metal box that had been secured with a heavy lock. Unlike the surrounding materials, which showed the effects of age and exposure, the box appeared remarkably well preserved, its surface gleaming dully in the lantern light. As John approached the pedestal, he noticed another 8-pointed star carved into its base, confirming his suspicion that this was indeed connected to Josiah's rituals. The lock on the box was old-fashioned but sturdy, unlikely to yield to force without potentially damaging the contents. John examined it closely, noting a small indentation on one side that appeared designed to receive a specific key rather than a standard one. He remembered the pendant Sheriff Miller had shown him, its 8-pointed shape similar in size to this indentation. Could the silver stars worn by Josiah's followers have served a practical purpose beyond their symbolic one, functioning as keys to access hidden caches of knowledge? Without such a key in his possession, John was forced to consider alternative approaches. He could attempt to break the lock, though this risked damaging whatever lay inside. He could search for Margaret and William, assuming they possessed a key, though this would mean confronting them directly and potentially alerting them to his discovery. Or he could return to the manor and search for one of the pendants among the family heirlooms, though time was growing short, with only 3 days remaining until the alignment. As he weighed these options, a sound from the passage behind him made him freeze. The subtle scrape of boot on stone, followed by a whispered voice. Someone had followed him to the hidden chamber, or perhaps had been watching the creek bend and noted his arrival. John quickly extinguished his lantern and pressed himself against the wall beside the entrance, drawing his pistol. Seconds later, a figure emerged into the chamber, silhouetted against the dim light filtering in from the passage. It was William Emerson, moving with the cautious precision of someone trying to remain undetected. He carried a small lamp in one hand and what appeared to be a rolled parchment in the other. Most significantly, around his neck hung a silver pendant in the shape of an 8-pointed star, catching the light as he moved. William approached the pedestal, seemingly unaware of John's presence in the shadows, and began examining the locked box with evident excitement. "Where's my sister, William?" John's voice cut through the stillness of the chamber, causing the younger man to whirl around in alarm, nearly dropping his lamp in the process. For a moment, William's face registered pure shock, his scholarly features frozen in an expression of disbelief. Then, surprisingly, he relaxed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Blackwood, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to find you here. The blood calls to its own, after all." There was something unsettling about his tone, a familiarity that bordered on condescension, as if he were speaking to a child who had stumbled upon an adult conversation. "As for Margaret, she's attending to her part of the preparations. We divided the tasks between us. More efficient that way." John stepped forward, keeping his pistol trained on William, but making no immediate move to use it. "What preparations? What exactly are you and Margaret planning?" William's smile widened, taking on an almost evangelical fervor. The culmination of what Josiah began, of course, the completion of the great work that has been in motion for 3 generations. In 3 days, at the dark of the moon, the stars will align just as they did in Josiah's time, and the gateway will open fully. When it does, the exchange will occur, the final payment on our ancestors' bargain, and the beginning of a new era for those of us who understand its significance. The casual way William included himself in our ancestors' legacy wasn't lost on John. "You're not a Blackwood," he pointed out, though even as he spoke, he noted the familiar angles of William's face, the set of his eyes that did indeed echo certain family characteristics. William laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space. "Not in name, perhaps, but Josiah's blood runs in many veins throughout Shadow Creek, Mr. Blackwood. He was not selective in spreading his lineage. My grandmother was the product of one such union, unacknowledged by your branch of the family, but no less genuine for that. We who wear the star are all children of Josiah in one way or another, all heirs to his vision and his promise." And this revelation, while surprising, aligned with certain whispers John had heard throughout his life, rumors of illegitimate Blackwood offspring, of connections that extended beyond the official family tree. It also explained how knowledge of Josiah's practices might have persisted outside the main family line, passed down through generations of these unrecognized descendants. "And what exactly is this exchange you mentioned?" John asked, hoping to keep William talking while he assessed the situation. The younger man seemed eager to explain, perhaps seeing in John a potential convert to whatever cause he represented. The gateway allows passage in both directions, Mr. Blackwood. For decades, we have sent tribute through consciousness, life force, the essential energy of being. In return, we have received prosperity, protection, knowledge beyond ordinary human understanding. But at the alignment, something greater becomes possible, a true exchange of essence. Those who have been prepared can cross fully into the realm beyond, while entities from that realm can manifest fully in ours. The implications were staggering. William wasn't describing mere disappearances or abstract mystical concepts. He was talking about some kind of mass crossing, with humans entering whatever lay beyond the gateway, while otherworldly beings took their place in Shadow Creek. How many people are involved in this? John demanded, his grip tightening on the pistol. How many wear the star? William considered the question, seemingly unconcerned by John's increasingly evident hostility. 53 at present, scattered throughout Shadow Creek and neighboring communities. Each has been carefully selected and prepared over years, made ready for transcendence, and each position must be filled. The symmetry of the exchange requires it. For every consciousness that crosses over, a space must be created for what comes through in return. And the recent disappearances? The Thornton boy and the others? John pressed, though he already suspected the answer. William nodded, his expression suggesting he saw nothing troubling in what he was about to explain. Preliminary adjustments. The gateway has been leaking for months as the alignment approaches. Some individuals have responded to its call prematurely, drawn to cross before the proper time. Others have been removed because their presence might disrupt the alignment. Your workers finding the altar stone was unfortunate. It should have remained buried until the appointed hour, but we've adapted our plans accordingly. The casualness with which William discussed these removals confirmed John's worst fears about what he and Margaret had set in motion. And the text? John gestured toward the locked box on the pedestal. What's in there that's so important to your plans? For the first time, William's confidence seemed to waver slightly. The words of unmaking, the final incantation that will open the gateway completely at the moment of alignment. Without them, the exchange cannot be completed. Josiah encoded them separately from his other writings, ensuring they would only be accessible to those who truly understood the importance of his work. He touched the star pendant hanging from his neck. These serve as both keys and markers, identifying those worthy of crossing and providing access to the hidden knowledge needed to facilitate that crossing. John's mind raced, piecing together the full picture of what was unfolding in Shadow Creek. Not just a few isolated disappearances or a resurgence of old superstitions, but a coordinated effort involving dozens of people, all working towards some mass crossing during the upcoming alignment. If William spoke truth, in 3 days' time, 53 residents of the area would somehow cross through this gateway, while an equal number of unknown entities would take their place among the unsuspecting population. The potential for chaos, for harm on an unimaginable scale, was obvious. And Margaret, what's her role in all this? John asked, needing to understand his sister's involvement before deciding how to proceed. William's expression darkened slightly. Margaret has been essential to our preparations. Her access to family records, her position within the community, these have allowed our work to proceed undetected. But recently, she's become hesitant, questioning aspects of the exchange that have been settled for generations. Some of us have concerns about her commitment to seeing the great work completed as Josiah intended. This confirmed the impression John had formed during his confrontation with Margaret in the library, that while she maintained the family's darker traditions, she might not fully embrace whatever endgame William and his fellow star-wearers envisioned. I need to speak with her, John said firmly, before any of this goes further. Where is she now? William shook his head, his earlier friendliness giving way to wary calculation. I don't think that would be productive, Mr. Blackwood. You've made your feelings about the family legacy quite clear over the years. Margaret may be wavering, but you've actively worked to bury what Josiah built. We can't risk you interfering at this critical juncture. He reached into his coat, presumably for a weapon, but John was faster. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between them, pressing the barrel of his pistol against William's chest. This isn't a negotiation, William. Tell me where my sister is, or I'll ensure you're not part of this exchange you're so eager to complete." The threat had its intended effect. William's hand froze, then slowly withdrew from his coat empty. "She's at the Standing Stones, performing the ritual of preparation for those crossing tomorrow night. But you're too late to stop what's been set in motion, Mr. Blackwood. The stars continue their course regardless of human doubts or interference." John kept the pistol steady as he reached for the star pendant hanging around William's neck, tearing it free with a sharp tug. "We'll see about that." Using his free hand, he inserted the 8-pointed star into the indentation on the lock of the metal box. It fit perfectly, and with a slight turn, the lock mechanism released, the lid of the box opening with a soft click. Inside lay a single item, a small leather-bound book, its cover unmarked, but its pages clearly filled with dense writing in Josiah's distinctive hand. John took it, tucking it securely inside his coat, then returned his attention to William. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to lead me to the Standing Stones. You're going to help me convince Margaret to abandon this insanity. And then we're going to find a way to stop this exchange before it tears Shadow Creek apart." William's expression had changed again, a strange mixture of fear and excitement, replacing his earlier confidence. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he warned. "The beings on the other side don't respond well to broken promises. The bargain must be honored one way or another." "I'll take my chances," John replied grimly, gesturing with the pistol toward the passage leading out of the chamber. "Now move." As they emerged from the creek bank into the late afternoon sunlight, John was struck by how ordinary the world appeared, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, birds calling to one another, the water flowing peacefully over its bed of black pebbles. How strange that beneath this tranquil surface, forces beyond human comprehension were gathering, preparing to reshape the reality of Shadow Creek in ways its inhabitants could scarcely imagine. And how strange that he, John Blackwood, who had spent decades running from his family's legacy, now found himself its reluctant defender, perhaps the only person who could prevent the catastrophe his ancestor had set in motion generations ago. The Standing Stones were located several miles deeper into the East Woods, in a clearing that local folklore claimed had been sacred to the native tribes long before European settlement. As John and William approached, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the ancient monoliths appear taller and more ominous than their actual size warranted. There were 13 stones in total, arranged in a circle with a smaller central stone serving as a kind of altar, and there, kneeling before this central stone with her back to the newcomers, was Margaret, surrounded by a group of about 20 individuals, all wearing the now familiar 8-pointed star pendants. They were engaged in what appeared to be a ritual, their voices raised in a chant whose words John couldn't quite distinguish, but whose rhythm sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. "The ritual of preparation," William whispered, his voice a mixture of reverence and anticipation. "They're being made ready for tomorrow night's crossing, the first wave. The rest will follow at the alignment itself." John tightened his grip on William's arm, keeping the pistol concealed but ready. "Call out to her! Tell her you've brought me to join the ceremony." William hesitated, clearly weighing his options, then apparently decided cooperation was his safest course. "Margaret," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I've brought your brother. He wishes to witness the preparations." The chanting stopped abruptly, all heads turning toward the unexpected interruption. Margaret rose from her kneeling position, her expression shifting from shock to anger to a calculated neutrality as she assessed the situation. "John," she acknowledged, her voice carrying easily in the sudden silence, "this is unexpected and unwelcome." She glanced at William, noting his tense posture and the way John stood close behind him. "I see my colleague has been less than forthcoming about the circumstances of your arrival. No matter, you're here now, and perhaps that's for the best. You should witness what you've spent so long denying, the true power and purpose of our family's heritage." John guided William forward into the clearing, maintaining a firm grip on his arm while scanning the gathered faces. He recognized several: the town's schoolteacher, a banker, the blacksmith's son, ordinary citizens of Shadow Creek who had apparently been living double lives as members of this secret society. All watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility, clearly viewing his arrival as a potential threat to whatever they had planned. "I've seen enough already," John replied, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through him. "I know about the alignment, the exchange, the bargain Josiah made, and I know it has to stop, Margaret. Whatever benefits our family has reaped from this arrangement, the price is too high." Margaret's laugh was harsh, cutting through the evening air like a knife. "Too high? Look around you, brother. Everything we have, our land, our wealth, our position in this community, all of it stems from the bargain Josiah struck. You've enjoyed these benefits your entire life while rejecting their source. That's not nobility, John. It's hypocrisy." She gestured to the gathered group. "These people understand what you never have, that prosperity requires sacrifice, that power demands exchange. In 3 days' time, they will transcend ordinary existence, crossing into a realm of pure consciousness and potential. And in return, Shadow Creek will enter a new era of unprecedented growth and influence under the guidance of those who come through from the other side." "And what exactly are these beings that will be coming through?" John demanded. "Have you seen them, spoken with them? Do you have any idea what their intentions might be once they're here?" Margaret's confidence wavered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she mastered it. "They are ancient intelligences, entities that existed before human civilization, and will exist long after it's gone. Their perspective transcends our limited understanding of good and evil, right and wrong. They seek experience, knowledge, the unique sensations that physical existence provides. In exchange for this opportunity, they offer wisdom and abilities beyond ordinary human capacity." John reached into his coat and withdrew Josiah's hidden text, holding it up for Margaret to see. "I found this at the creek bend. It contains the words of unmaking, the final incantation needed to complete the exchange." A murmur ran through the gathered star-wearers, and Margaret's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "You've been busy," she said, her tone more respectful than before. "We've been searching for that text for weeks. William assured me he knew where it was hidden." She shot a sharp glance at William, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Apparently, his confidence was misplaced. "The text stays with me," John said firmly. "Without it, the gateway can't be fully opened, correct? The alignment will pass, and this exchange you're planning won't happen." He wasn't certain this was true. The apparition had been somewhat vague on the specifics, but the reaction from the gathered group suggested he'd hit close to the mark. Several of them stepped forward aggressively, only to halt when Margaret raised her hand. "You don't understand the consequences of interference, John," she said, her voice taking on a new urgency. "The bargain must be honored. If the exchange doesn't occur as promised, there will be repercussions, severe ones, for everyone in Shadow Creek, not just those of us who wear the star." For the first time, John detected genuine fear beneath his sister's determination. Not fear of him or what he might do, but fear of what might happen if the bargain Josiah had struck was broken. This aligned with William's earlier warning about the entities on the other side not responding well to broken promises. "Tell me the truth, Margaret," he said, softening his tone slightly. "Are you certain this exchange will unfold as you believe, that these beings will be benevolent guides rather than destructive forces, that the people who cross over will find transcendence rather than something far worse?" Margaret didn't answer immediately, her silence more revealing than any words could have been. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "Nothing of value comes without risk, John. Josiah understood this. He took a calculated gamble that has benefited our family for generations. A gamble with other people's lives," John countered, "with the future of an entire community. And now you're preparing to double down on that bet, to send 53 people across some boundary we barely understand, while allowing unknown entities to take their place among us." He gestured to the gathered star-wearers. "Have any of you actually seen what's on the other side? Has anyone who's crossed ever returned to confirm this transcendence you've been promised?" The uncomfortable shifting among the group told him everything he needed to know. Their belief was based on faith and tradition, not direct evidence, a dangerous foundation for the momentous step they were preparing to take. Margaret seemed to sense the doubt John's questions had sown. "Enough," she said sharply. "The hour grows late, and we have preparations to complete. John, you've made your concerns clear, but the path was set long before either of us was born. The alignment approaches regardless of our individual doubts or desires." She extended her hand. "Give me the text. Let me complete what our ancestor began, what our father continued, what falls now to us as the last of the main Blackwood line. Together, we can guide Shadow Creek into a new era of prosperity and enlightenment." In that moment, looking at his sister's outstretched hand and the expectant faces of the star-wearers behind her, John made his decision, not based on fear or rejection of his heritage, but on a clear-eyed assessment of the situation and its potential consequences. "No," he said simply, "this ends now. Whatever bargain Josiah made, whatever price he thought acceptable, I'm not willing to sacrifice 53 lives or risk the safety of everyone in Shadow Creek to honor it. There must be another way to address the consequences of breaking the agreement. A way that doesn't involve this exchange." Margaret's face hardened, her hand dropping to her side. "You always were stubborn, John, even as a child, but this isn't a matter where your personal feelings carry any weight. The star-wearers are committed, the preparations are nearly complete, and if you won't assist us willingly, we'll simply take the text and proceed without you." At her gesture, several of the larger men in the group began moving toward John, their intentions clear. He raised the pistol, aiming it not at them, but at the book in his own hand. "One more step, and I destroy it," he warned. "Without the words of unmaking, your ritual can't be completed. The gateway will remain partially closed, and your exchange will fail." This threat stopped them in their tracks, uncertainty replacing their earlier determination. Margaret looked genuinely alarmed for the first time. "You wouldn't dare. The consequences—" John cut her off. "I'm willing to face the consequences, whatever they may be. Are you willing to face the consequences of bringing unknown entities into our world, of sending these people into a realm from which no one has ever returned? Think, Margaret, not as a Blackwood, not as a keeper of traditions, but as a human being with responsibility for other human lives." His words seemed to reach something in Margaret that previous arguments hadn't touched. She looked around at the gathered star-wearers, not with the zealot's fervor she had displayed earlier, but with a new awareness of their humanity, their vulnerability. These weren't abstract sacrifices for some greater purpose. They were neighbors, friends, members of a community she had known her entire life. "What do you propose instead?" she asked finally, her voice lower, less certain. "The alignment comes regardless. The gateway will still thin. Something must be done to address the bargain Josiah made." John nodded, acknowledging the validity of her concern while sensing an opening for compromise. "Let me read the text first. Let me understand exactly what Josiah planned and what alternatives might exist. There may be a way to modify the ritual, to offer something other than human consciousness as payment." Margaret considered this, visibly torn between the tradition she had upheld for decades and the doubts her brother had awakened. The star-wearers watched tensely, their own certainty wavering in the face of this unexpected division between the Blackwood siblings. Finally, Margaret nodded. 3 days. You have until the dark of the moon to find an alternative that will satisfy the terms of the bargain without requiring the exchange as Josiah designed it. If you cannot, we proceed as planned. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start, a chance to find another solution, to prevent the catastrophe that seemed to be bearing down on Shadow Creek, with the inevitability of the approaching alignment. As the gathered star-wearers dispersed, their ceremony disrupted by John's intervention, Margaret approached her brother privately. "You should know," she said quietly, "that I've had my own doubts about the exchange. Not about the reality of what Josiah discovered, I've seen too much evidence to question that, but about the nature of the entities on the other side. They speak with many voices, John, and not all of them inspire confidence." This admission confirmed John's suspicion that Margaret's commitment to the ritual wasn't as absolute as she had pretended. "Then help me find another way," he urged. "Together, we might discover an alternative that honors the essence of Josiah's bargain without risking the lives of everyone involved." For For the first time in decades, John saw a genuine smile cross his sister's face, not the condescending expression she had worn in the library, but something warmer, reminiscent of the young girl she had been before their father's training had hardened her. "Perhaps it's fitting," she said thoughtfully. "The first Blackwood made the bargain. The last Blackwoods will determine how it's honored." She glanced toward William, who stood apart from the others, his expression sullen. "Be careful, though. Not everyone who wears the star will accept a change of plans so easily. Some have invested too much in the promise of transcendence to abandon it now, no matter what alternative you might propose." With this warning in mind, John returned to the manor, the hidden text secure in his possession and a new sense of purpose driving him. The next 3 days would determine not just the fate of the Star Wearers, but potentially the future of Shadow Creek itself. As he settled into his study, preparing for a night of intensive reading and research, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had spent decades running from his family's legacy, only to find himself now embracing it, not to continue Josiah's work, but to transform it into something that might bring genuine benefit without the terrible cost his ancestor had deemed acceptable. In doing so, he might finally achieve what had eluded him his entire life, a way to be a Blackwood on his own terms, honoring the power of his heritage while rejecting its darker aspects. The hidden text proved to be more complex and revealing than John had anticipated. Unlike Josiah's journal, which documented rituals and observations in a relatively straightforward manner, this volume was part philosophical treatise, part mystical revelation. It described in detail the nature of the boundary Josiah had discovered, the entities that existed beyond it, and the specific mechanisms by which the exchange was meant to operate. Most importantly, it revealed that Josiah himself had considered alternatives to human sacrifice, exploring various substitutions before concluding that consciousness was the only tribute the entities would accept. However, a marginal note near the end of the text suggested a possibility Josiah had never fully explored, that the essential element valued by the entities wasn't human consciousness specifically, but rather the unique energy generated by conscious choice, by willing participation in the crossing. This insight provided the foundation for the alternative John began to formulate. If the entities required the energy of conscious choice rather than the consciousness itself, perhaps the Star Wearers could participate in a ritual that generated this energy without actually crossing the boundary. They could approach the threshold, experience the pull of what lay beyond, even glimpse the realm they had been promised, but then choose to return, channeling the powerful energy of that choice into sustaining the barrier between worlds rather than breaching it. It would require modifications to the ritual described in the text, and most challengingly, it would require convincing the Star Wearers to accept this alternative to the transcendence they had been promised. But it offered a way to honor the essence of Josiah's bargain without sacrificing 53 lives or risking the infiltration of unknown entities into Shadow Creek. As dawn broke on the day of the alignment, John presented his proposal to Margaret, who had spent the night at the manor after their confrontation at the Standing Stones. She listened intently, asking pointed questions that revealed her own deep understanding of the metaphysical principles involved. It could work, she acknowledged finally. The energy generated by approaching the threshold and then choosing to turn back might actually be greater than that produced by a simple crossing. The entities value novelty, experience. This would provide something they haven't encountered before. Her expression grew troubled. But convincing the Star Wearers will be difficult. Many have been preparing for this moment their entire lives. The promise of transcendence has sustained them through hardship, given meaning to their existence. Taking that away now, offering instead a momentary glimpse, followed by a return to ordinary life. Some will resist fiercely. John understood the challenge, but also saw no alternative if disaster was to be averted. Together, he and Margaret spent the day visiting key members of the Star Wearers, explaining the new approach and the reasoning behind it. Some, particularly the older members who had known John and Margaret since childhood, were receptive to the change, trusting in the Blackwood siblings' deeper understanding of the forces involved. Others were skeptical but willing to be convinced, especially when shown specific passages from Josiah's hidden text that supported the alternative interpretation. But a significant minority, led by William Emerson, rejected the proposal outright, insisting that the exchange must proceed as originally planned, that anything else would constitute a betrayal of both Josiah's vision and their own decades of preparation. This division among the star-wearers created a volatile situation as night fell and the time of the alignment approached. The two factions gathered separately, John, Margaret and their supporters at the manor, preparing for the modified ritual that would honor the bargain without completing the exchange. William and his followers at the altar stone, determined to proceed with the original plan, despite lacking the words of unmaking contained in the hidden text. John knew that William's attempt was doomed to failure without the complete incantation, but feared that an incomplete opening of the gateway might cause even greater damage than a controlled exchange. As the hour drew near, he made a difficult decision. He would go to the altar stone himself, taking the hidden text, and attempt to convince William's group to join the modified ritual before it was too late. The night was unnaturally still as John rode toward the north field where the altar stone had been uncovered. No wind stirred the trees, no animals called in the darkness, as if all of nature was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The sky above was clear, the stars unusually bright, their patterns matching exactly the configurations described in Josiah's writings. As John approached the field, he could see that William had gathered about 20 followers, fewer than he had feared, but still a significant number. They had completely excavated the altar stone, which now stood fully revealed, its surface covered with symbols that glowed faintly in the starlight. William stood before it, wearing elaborate robes that mimicked descriptions of Josiah's ritual attire, reciting phrases that John recognized as fragments of the words of unmaking. Incomplete, imprecise, but potentially dangerous nonetheless. John dismounted some distance away, approaching on foot with the hidden text in hand. He had rehearsed what he would say, prepared arguments that he hoped would sway even the most committed adherents of the original exchange. But as he drew closer, he realized that something was already happening at the altar, something William's incomplete incantation should not have been able to initiate. The air around the stone was shimmering, distorting like heat waves rising from sun-baked earth, and within that distortion, shapes were beginning to form, indistinct, fluid, but undeniably present. The barrier between worlds was thinning without the need for the complete ritual, the alignment itself providing enough power for at least a partial opening of the gateway. "William!" John called out, his voice cutting through the monotonous chanting. "Stop this now! You're opening something you can't control!" William turned, his face illuminated by the strange light emanating from the shimmering air, his expression a mixture of triumph and fear. "It's too late, Blackwood. The alignment is here, and the gateway opens whether you approve or not. Our ancestors set this in motion generations ago. All we're doing is fulfilling what they began." But even as he spoke, uncertainty crept into his voice, his eyes darting to the increasingly distinct shapes forming in the air around the altar. These weren't the benevolent guides or transcendent beings the star-wearers had been promised. They were amorphous, unsettling forms that seemed to shift between states of matter, their movements suggesting an alien intelligence with motives impossible to discern. In that moment of collective realization, as William and his followers began to understand what they had nearly invited into their world, John saw his opportunity. "There's still time to change course," he called out, holding up the hidden text. Josiah discovered the gateway, but he also discovered how to regulate it, how to interact with what lies beyond without surrendering to it completely. "Join us at the manor. Help us perform the modified ritual. We can still honor the bargain without completing the exchange." The shimmering forms seemed to react to his words, their movements becoming more agitated, more focused on the assembled humans. Several of William's followers backed away from the altar, their earlier certainty giving way to primal fear as they confronted the reality of what awaited beyond the thinning barrier. William himself stood frozen, transfixed by the manifestations he had helped summon, his grand vision of transcendence crumbling in the face of their alien reality. "This isn't what was promised," he whispered, though whether to John or to the entities themselves wasn't clear. "This isn't the ascension we prepared for." John approached him carefully, maintaining a respectful distance from both William and the shimmering gateway. "No bargain is worth this price, William. Whatever benefits our family gained from Josiah's arrangement, whatever power or prosperity it brought us, nothing justifies sacrificing lives to entities we clearly don't understand." He extended his hand, offering not just the book, but a chance at redemption. "Help me close this properly. Help me find a better way forward for Shadow Creek, one that honors our heritage without being enslaved to it." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, William stood poised between choices, between clinging to the path he had followed for decades and acknowledging that it led to a destination far darker than he had imagined. Around them, his followers were already making their decisions, most backing away from the altar, a few fleeing outright into the night. The shimmering forms grew more distinct, more insistent, reaching tendrils of influence toward the humans who had summoned them, seeking the crossing points they had been promised. And then, with a suddenness that surprised even John, William made his choice. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "How do we close this without breaking the bargain entirely?" With William's capitulation, the tide turned decisively. The remaining star-wearers at the altar stone abandoned their positions, joining John and William as they retreated to a safe distance. Using the hidden text as a guide, John performed a temporary sealing, not a permanent closure of the gateway, which would indeed break Josiah's bargain completely, but a suspension, a postponement that would allow time for the full modified ritual to be prepared at the manor. The shimmering forms resisted, pressing against the thinning barrier, seeking any weakness they might exploit, but the sealing held, the partial opening stabilizing into a state that would remain manageable until the proper ritual could be completed. As they rode back to the manor, the unified group of star-wearers now committed to John's alternative approach, William remained unusually silent, his earlier confidence replaced by a somber thoughtfulness. "I saw them clearly," he finally said as they neared the Blackwood property, "not as they've appeared in visions or dreams, but as they truly are. And I understood something that Josiah either never realized or chose to ignore. They don't view us as partners or equals. We're resources to them, nothing more." John nodded, recognizing the profound shift this represented in William's worldview, which is why we need to change the nature of our interaction with them. Not subservience, not sacrifice, but a controlled exchange of energy that maintains the boundary between our worlds while still honoring the essence of the original agreement. At the manor, Margaret had prepared everything for the modified ritual, gathering her faction of star-wearers in the grand hall where generations of Blackwoods had hosted community celebrations. The space had been arranged according to John's specifications, with participants positioned to channel their collective energy towards sustaining the barrier rather than breaching it. As William's group joined them, completing the circle of 53 star-wearers, a palpable sense of purpose filled the room. Not the blind zealotry that had characterized the gathering at the altar stone, but something more measured, more human. These were people making a conscious choice to protect their community while still honoring the traditions that had shaped their identities. The ritual itself was both simpler and more profound than the exchange it replaced. Following the guidance in Josiah's hidden text, modified by John's insights, each participant approached a symbolic threshold, not a physical gateway but a psychological one, a moment of choice between transcendence and return. Each experienced, briefly and intensely, the pull of what lay beyond the barrier, the promise of knowledge and experience beyond ordinary human capacity, and each, in turn, made the conscious decision to return, to remain anchored in the world they knew, channeling the powerful energy generated by that choice into reinforcing the boundary between realms. The entities beyond the barrier received their tribute, Not the full consciousness of 53 humans, but the concentrated essence of their decision, a form of energy perhaps more valuable for its rarity and the free will it represented. As dawn broke over Shadow Creek, the ritual reached its completion. The 53 star-wearers, exhausted but intact, experienced a collective sense of both loss and liberation. Loss of the transcendence they had been promised, but liberation from the burden of a bargain that would have claimed their very existence. John, who had led the ritual with Margaret's assistance, felt a deeper transformation taking place within himself. For the first time in his life, he had fully embraced his heritage as a Blackwood, not by rejecting its darker aspects or by surrendering to them, but by transforming them into something that served life rather than sacrificed it. He had taken Josiah's legacy and reshaped it, honoring its power while redirecting its purpose. In the days that followed, life in Shadow Creek gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. The Star-Wearers, their secret society now disbanded, reintegrated into the community, many finding new purpose in more conventional forms of service and contribution. William Emerson, humbled by his confrontation with the true nature of the entities he had nearly invited into the world, devoted himself to documenting the complete history of Josiah's bargain and its consequences, creating a record that would serve as both warning and guide for future generations. Margaret, released from her role as keeper of the family's darkest traditions, discovered a talent for teaching, sharing her extensive knowledge of local history and folklore with the town's children, carefully edited to exclude the more dangerous elements, of course. As for John Blackwood, he found himself in the unexpected position of community leader in a more public and positive sense than ever before. The respect he had earned through his handling of the alignment crisis, though most townspeople knew only that he had resolved some unspecified threat to Shadow Creek's well-being, translated into increased influence in civic affairs. He used this influence to implement changes that had long been needed, improvements to the town's infrastructure, expansion of educational opportunities, development of new industries that would provide sustainable prosperity without reliance on supernatural bargains. In doing so, he created a new legacy for the Blackwood name, one based on genuine service rather than secret power. The altar stone was permanently buried, this time under a foundation of solid concrete that would discourage future excavation. The standing stones were preserved as a historical site, their original purpose reframed in educational materials as a Native American ceremonial ground rather than a focus for otherworldly rituals. The creek bend with its black pebbles became a popular spot for family picnics, its hidden chamber sealed and eventually forgotten. And Josiah's hidden text, along with his journal and all other records of the bargain he had struck, were secured in a vault beneath the manor, accessible only to those who bore the Blackwood name and had demonstrated the wisdom to use such knowledge responsibly. On the anniversary of the alignment, John stood on the porch of the manor house, watching storm clouds gather over the distant hills, just as he had when this journey began. But now, instead of dread, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The storm would bring needed rain to the fields, nourishing crops planted and tended by human hands, harvested through human effort. Shadow Creek's prosperity no longer depended on bargains with entities beyond human understanding, but on the community's own resourcefulness and determination. As lightning flashed on the horizon, John thought he glimpsed, just for an instant, a familiar eight-pointed star pattern in the branching electricity. Not a warning or a threat, but a reminder of choices made, of paths not taken, of a heritage transformed rather than rejected or blindly embraced. And in that moment, John Blackwood, last of his name but first of a new tradition, knew that he had found the balance his ancestors had always sought but never truly achieved, the ability to acknowledge the darkness while walking steadfastly in the light.